And thou hast walked about, how strange a story, in Thebes' streets 3,000 years ago, when the Memnonium was in all its glory, and time had not begun to overthrow those temples, palaces, and piles stupendous, of which the very ruins are tremendous. Speak, for thou long enough hast acted dummy. Thou hast a tongue, come, let us hear its tune. Thou art standing on thy legs, above ground, mummy. That was lines 1 through 9 of Horace Smith's Address to a Mummy at Belzoni's exhibition. From this excerpt, you might have already ascertained that the subject of my podcast today will be the Egyptian mummy in the 19th century. The main question my podcast explores is, why were people in the 19th century, particularly the Victorians, so obsessed with mummies? I'll be using sources from the library special collections and several articles concerning the topic to formulate some theories throughout the podcast. And of course, I'll be making connections back to the literature of the era, some of which are my personal favorites, such as Frankenstein, Jane Eyre, Castle of Otranto, Safoya, and Ivanhoe. My podcast will be split into 2 sections, one on the colonial and industrial implications of 19th century mummy mania, and then the Gothic relations of mummy mania, with a few connecting links between the two. I place colonial and industrial under the same subheading in my podcast, as these are 2 areas of 19th century culture that are intimately tied. For more information on the innate connections between industrialism and colonialism in the 19th century and beyond, I highly recommend Lisa Lowe's The Intimacies of the Four Continents and Anne McClintock's Imperial Leather. I would love to go into more detail on these sources and this topic and how they inform my discussion of mummies, but I really don't want to subtract time from my more in-depth analysis of mummy mania. Before I go into the details of my findings, I'd like to talk a little about the context of Egypt in the 19th century. Amidst efforts of industrialization and colonization, both by the French and the English, many artifacts were taken out of the country by both amateur archaeologists and Englishmen on their alternative route of the Grand Tour. Of course, all of this is during and following Napoleon's campaign of Egypt, where he commissioned authors and archaeologists to write about the area. It was during this time that the Rosetta Stone was found, which the English then took from the French and is now on display at the British Museum. All of these circumstances place Egypt at an odd crossroads of national identity for the English, and their current situation, rendered by the French, made it a place ripe for exploitation. Section 1. The colonial and industrial implications of mummy. I think for some writers and academics, the mummy was a way to locate their fears of the shifting sands of class and gender structures in the 19th century. Some writings focusing on the past during the Industrial Revolution seem to highlight and uphold strict gender and class binaries. Think about the gender and class structures in Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe. Even though the story ended with social change and the unification of Saxons and Normans, women were either married off or sent to convents, and serfs were still indentured. This theme in historical writing may be a reflection of the wish for a return to such rigid binaries, when women were, mostly by need of poverty, pushed out of the home and into the workplace, and preset class structures were thrown into chaos. In the writings on mummies that I consulted in special collections, much importance is placed on the specific mummy's place in a class structure. In The Mummy, chapters on Egyptian funeral archaeology, E.A. Wallace Budge details how the poor are simply rubbed down with mummifying chemicals, loosely wrapped and left in the desert for nature to do her job on the body, basically, while the rich have the utmost care taken in the preservation of their bodies. In the lines I recited from Address to the Mummy, Smith rejoices in the greatness of Memnonium that the mummy would have witnessed before death, before time overthrew it, demonstrating a yearning for a great past that hasn't been reduced to rubble by the passage of time. One facet of the mummy in Victorian culture is the mummy as spectacle, particularly in public mummy unwrapping parties. In Gabriel Mashinska's article, Unrolling Egyptian Mummies in 19th Century Britain, he details events held by Dr. Thomas Mummy Pettigrew, in which he unwrapped mummies for a paying audience. He argues the Egyptian mummy, whose journey from exotic commodity to scientific object ended, as often as not, with the shriveled corpse displayed naked upon a table. The mummy as spectacle reflects the dual colonial industrial attitudes with which these mummified beings were treated. Instead of a person laid to rest, they had become a commodity, an exotic product, symbolizing the grand bygone era of the land now considered uncivilized. Continuing the trend of the mummy as spectacle to our modern moment, many of these same mummies collected and unwrapped in the 19th century are still available for the public to view at the British Museum. This attitude of the commodification of the mummy is reinforced by Edward Upham in his 1822 publication, Memoranda, illustrative of the tombs and sepulchral decorations of the Egyptians. He makes specific emphasis on the price of mummification. He writes, "We are lost in surprise and amazement how such a process could be established, and if by resins, drugs, or spices, from whence such profuse quantities could be procured and supplied. If by any more summary and inexpensive process, how curious and important might be the recovery of such a secret." When I read this in the archives, I immediately thought about the colonial scramble for global resources by the British Empire, and how these mummified bodies perfectly personify the idea of the ignorant abundance of colonized people. Further explicating this idea of ignorant abundance, Giovanni Belzoni, the circus strongman turned archaeologist, who also sourced the vast majority of the Egyptian wing at the British Museum, notes in his publication, Description of the Egyptian Tomb discovered by G. Belzoni, which I also access from special collections, that he has frequently seen in the dwellings of the Arabs, magazines as it were, well stocked with mummies, large pieces of asphaltum, much used and prized by painters, and other objects of antiquity procured from these caverns. Belzoni's writing implies that the colonized Arabs don't know the value of the commodity they possess, that commodity being actual human bodies. This placement of monetary value on the human body leads me to draw a tenuous connection between the mummy trade and the transatlantic slave trade. The question I kept returning to in reading these texts was, what could possibly be the value of a human body? And I couldn't help but make a comparison between the theft and trade of dead human bodies from Egypt and the theft and trade of live bodies from sub-Saharan Africa. Furthermore, Thomas Pettigrew made a considerable industry out of his study of mummies. Muszynska notes the doctor's success in publishing. At almost 300 quarto pages with plates, including color plates, the book was expensive to produce and sold at a rather steep 2 guineas, alongside his list of over 300 subscribers for the volume. Having accessed it in special collections, it is a rather impressive, physical object. There's color plates, and on some of them, there's gold leaf put on. It's a really interesting text to just have and hold, and it smells quite interesting as well, as a funny side note. As well, the plates in Pettigrew's publication were made by none other than George Cruikshank, the illustrator for Charles Dickens. Pettigrew's money made from the exploitation of colonial resources, the mummy, seems to parallel the fortunes made on sugar or indigo plantations in the Americas, minus, of course, the sheer brutality of the transatlantic slave trade. However, still with echoes of it, connecting back to my previous point about the trade of bodies, dead or alive. Part 2. The Gothic connotations of mummy. Now that I've made my points regarding the colonial and industrial implications of the mummy mania of the 19th century Britain, I'd like to move on to the Gothic connotations of mummies. While the mummy is an archetypal figure in many aspects of modern and contemporary Gothic, depictions of them in 19th century Gothic are rare. There is, of course, The Mummy by Jane Loudon, published in 1827 and set in the year 2126, but perhaps a more acute observation would be reading Frankenstein, one of Loudon's inspirations for her text, as a mummy Gothic. I make that claim as many of the descriptions of mummies, both in the physical and somewhat philosophical sense, resonate strongly with the first example of science fiction. In that same address to Belzoni's mummy, Smith describes its sightless eyes and off-colored skin, similar to the dun eyes and yellow skin of the creature. The yellow skin of the creature also brings us back to the colonial sphere, with the creature's skin color setting him apart as a non-white entity. As a whole, the poem addresses the mummy as a being that was once dead, but now is alive, mirroring the resurrection of the body parts into Frankenstein's creature. In Upham's memoranda, he claims Egypt, in the earliest ages of the world, had possessed herself of the most valuable secrets of nature, in reference to the practice of mummification. Upham's writing closely resembles Victor Frankenstein's pursuit of nature to her hiding places. The nail in the coffin, or maybe sarcophagus, to our comparison, comes from the text itself. A mummy again endued with animation could not be so hideous as that wretch. Shelley herself draws comparisons between the creature and the mummy. However, the creation of a living mummy is deemed more horrific than a reanimated one. There is also an importance on the clothes of a mummy. To those of us who went to Catherine Spooner's Gothic White talk the other week, some of these points will ring familiarly. Spooner notes that the white dress has been ubiquitous in Gothic fiction, from the distressed Radcliffean heroine in a nightgown to Miss Havisham rotting away in the white rags of her unused wedding gown. I am considering the bandages of the mummy in the same light as the white dress of the Gothic woman. The forcible removal of these bandages, as described by Thomas Pettigrew as a task of no little difficulty and required considerable force to separate the layers of bandage from the body, eerily resembles the eventual stripping or destruction of the white dress in the attempted sexual assault of the Gothic heroine, a scene replayed in many Gothic novels such as Charlotte Dacre's Safoya. Tying this aspect of the Gothic back to the previous section on colonialism, the sexual assault of the mummy is a microscopic recreation of the symbolic rape of colonized lands for their resources. There are also strong connections between the tomb of the mummy and the trope of the Gothic house. The Gothic house is a particular favorite subject of mine. It's been thought of as a house that is inhospitable or outright deadly to the Gothic heroine. Think Thornfield Hall in Jane Eyre, or the castle in the Castle of Otranto. In Belzoni's publication, he described, of some of these tombs, many persons could not withstand the suffocating air, which often occasions fainting. Colonial readings of Jane Eyre feel especially relevant in this view of the Egyptian tomb as a Gothic house. Like Bertha, the colonized subject, or the mummy, inhabits the inhospitable house that causes harm to the delicate, white, colonial subject. This observation is astute when paired with Belzoni's descriptions of his native Egyptian guides, naked and covered in dust, themselves resembling live mummies, at once rendering them naked as the unwrapped mummy and commodified as the exotic object of the mummy. Belzoni's descriptions of his guides are also reminiscent of Victor Frankenstein's horror at the living mummy he had created. As a final note on the mummy and the Gothic, when I accessed Thomas Pettigrew's book, A History of Egyptian Mummies and an Account of the Worship and Embalming of the Sacred Animals by the Egyptians, I noticed that one of the chapters I was most curious about hadn't been cut. The chapter was titled Modern Embalmings, a few of which Pettigrew attempted, and one is right outside of Glasgow in a mausoleum. Upon this discovery, I wondered, would the reader have thought it taboo? Too scary? Would it have been like Joey Tribbiani in Friends, putting his copy of The Shining in the freezer because of how scary it was? Then my mind wandered to the common trope of the found manuscript in Gothic fiction. How maybe that was a secret that our reader may have preferred to stay locked away.